The time has come. Good morning, everyone. It is my pleasure to introduce our keynote speaker this morning. He is dubbed as the strategist of the century by the Journal of Business Strategy. Dr. Peter Michael Senge is the American systems scientist and a senior lecturer at the MIT Sloan School of Management, where he also finished his PhD in management. He is the founder of the Society of Organizational Learning and the Academy for Systemic Change. He is known as the author of the book, The Fifth Discipline, The Art and Practice of the Learning Organization. Dr. Peter is a proponent for what has become known as learning organizations, which are rooted on the principles of system thinking. His works has aided professionals, educators, businessmen, researchers improve their lives and organizations through personal mastery, leadership, and decentralized leadership. Friends, help me welcome the man of the hour to talk about dance with change in the age of complexity, Dr. Michael Peter Senge.
So, good morning, good afternoon, something in there, right? What would you say at this time of day in the Philippines? Would you still say good morning? Okay, good. So that's because we're all just kind of waking up still. So I'm glad I could join you. We're having a big systems thinking conference in the room next door. It kind of is convenient. Maybe this is the only place doing conferences today. I don't know. But in any event, it gets a little confusing because it's sort of like you walk out of one movie into the next, and it's in the room next door. So I have no historical contact with your association, so, but I do know a lot of similar associations around the world. Of course, most countries have an HR, people management association, but I thought just because I have so little contact here with what your work is in the Philippines, the easiest way to start off is just to ask you some questions, if you don't mind. And I know there's a couple of mics in the room, but if you're not close to a mic, I see they're even back there too. So what do you think the work of this association looks like, or how is it perceived to the people you most want to serve? And I'm obviously embedded in that question is the question, who do you most want to serve? Who do you see yourself as serving? And how do you aspire or hope that they will see you in the work of this association? Okay, so anybody may have some thoughts about that. I'd just be interested in just no long speeches, because it'd be nice to hear from several different people, because I always find that this field is actually quite different in different contexts. It's not like one common set of goals all around the world. Let me just say a few more words just to make sure you understand why I'm asking this question. All organizations, by definition, are made of people. Why do we need an association for this? I mean, we don't have an association for the machines. We don't have an association for the buildings. I know I'm being a little bit silly right now, but almost always the I'll just call them HR type associations, arise out of a historical context. And almost always it has something to do with a perception of a need to think differently and act differently regarding the people that make an organization. So that's kind of why I'm asking this question. It's just not the same. Different countries is really quite different. I could easily speak about the history of the HR or people management movement in the United States, but it might be quite different here. So anybody have any thoughts to kind of help me understand, so what is this association all about here in the Philippines?
Dr. Peter, I'm Dina Lumis of the Southeast Asia Speakers and Trainers Bureau. We consider ourselves, all of the members of PMAP, we consider ourselves as experts in our respective fields. Now, why do we want to belong to PMAP? It's because there are so many others who know what we do not know. So we gather together so that we learn from each other. That, for me, is the essence of being with PMAP.
Great.
And everyone here is so generous with his or her expertise. We share. That's why we're here.
Great, that's very helpful. Thank you. So the different fields you're referring to are HR management, training, coaching, organization development, right? Okay, good, thank you. That's very helpful. A couple others. And that was a useful comment about the association itself, this body itself, but also I'm very interested in the work, you might say, the field as you perceive it.
Good morning. My name is Mitch. I'd like to answer your first question, who do we serve, if that's okay.
Please,
yes, because I wake up in the morning thinking of our employees and my family and our employees' family. So if that answers your question.
That's great. When you said our employees, the employees of the Philippines, when you say who are they are?
Oh, the employees of my organization.
Of your organization. Great, thank you. That's very helpful. A couple others.
Good morning. I am very interested to be part of this organization, People Management Association of the Philippines, and I'm going to be a member today. I will sign in. I'm Professor Nelia Cruz Arcol. It is my desire as a future member of People Management Association of the Philippines, for the Philippines to have a human resource development program, maybe through this organization, because the Philippines needs to have that. We do not have that. The country or NEDA has not done that. So hopefully PMAP would have that. Why? Because if we think of macro systems, we think of our country, sustainable development, liberation from poverty, we have to align our value system. We have talked about mental models, principles, essences that encompass the different disciplines, but we have to arrive at a principle, a national ideology that maybe PMAP could spearhead, because only then could we have sustainable development that would bring us to the vision of what we have for our country. In another conference, we had launched, we were able to gather after 5 years of study what we call the People's Vision, created by the ordinary Filipino people, and we came up with the vision, People's Vision, a string of pearls, not from politicians, a soaring and tenacious republic instituted by nation-loving generations of passionate, ethical, action-driven, results-oriented leaders of society. Why? Because we are known as the country that is the pearl of the Orient. And every day, we practically sing it. Bayang Magiliw, Perlas ng Silanganan. We sing it every day, but we have not inculcated it into our system, the macro system of the Philippines. I hope to be able to work with PMAP on that. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. It's really helpful. Hopefully this is useful a little bit for you to hear as well. In other words, what are we doing here? What brings us here? Maybe one or two others. These have been very, very helpful. Anybody have something to add that's a little different? It could be something that's more personal or specific to your organization, or just something that's really important to you.
You were asking us about perceptions, how they look at us, our stakeholders.
Just get a little closer to the mic.
Our stakeholders, we are credible activists. credible that they believe in us. We are the human resource practitioners and professionals of our organizations. So they believe in us. And we make things happen. From organizing outings to conducting trainings, making sure that it's succession plan, and of course compensation. So we are look into our bosses, our employees look at us as credible. They believe in us, and because we act on it, we make things happen in our organizations.
Great.
Thank you.
Great, thank you, thank you. Any one or two others? Again, something that's important to you that has not been expressed yet. And don't worry, you don't have to represent the organization. I wasn't meaning my question as an official representation of the organization, but just in a sense of why am I here? Why does my business or my organization or just me support this or want to be part of it or want to have some influence on it?
Why am I here? I'd like to pay it forward. I think I've been blessed to be given opportunities to be trained by my previous organizations, and I think that helped me become a pretty decent HR practitioner. And I'm here because I'd like to share that experience. I'd like to give. I'd like to be an instrument for the association to also help the budding HR practitioners in the country and for them to do what is right for the profession.
Thank you. As you probably could tell, one of the reasons I wanted to ask this question also, having just walked out of another meeting in another room, which I understand very well, it's a global network of people I associate with a lot, and into a room of people I don't associate with a lot, I want to make sure I could hear enough of what's on your mind to make sure I'm not standing here but talking to them. So let me just offer a few general reflections as what I've seen on the evolution of this field, and then try to see if I can say something helpful vis-a-vis the particular aspirations, goals that you just articulated. First off, I'm going to ask a favor. John, could you hand me my coat there? It's really cold up here. I don't know how you feel. But, you know, I bring this coat along because why would anyone in their right mind bring a coat with them to the Philippines? It's really crazy. But unfortunately, having lived in a lot of other places that are somewhat warm, I know that we love air conditioning. And really, you know, I cart this coat all over the world. I almost never wear it, so at least now I have a reason that I brought it all around the world. How long ago would you say the term human resources or HR started to be used in this country? Because it's not a term that's been around for 50 years or even 100 years. Certainly not 100 years, and probably not even 50 years. What would you say? 30 years? Probably something in that vicinity. So I always find it's useful to start off. I think we all deal with very, very complex issues. Sometimes just reflecting on language. You're pointing out there's something that's 1956. But that's not a different question. That's the People Management Association. Was it called that in 1956? Personnel. Exactly. That's my point. So I asked a little different question, and you'll see exactly why I'm asking the question in a minute. HR, human resources. Okay, so it's all right. It's all right. I wasn't intending to spark a debate. Yeah, in the 80s. So here's the point. This is a kind of a worldwide shift. Most businesses, for a long period of time, going back probably 100 years, maybe some cases more, had personnel departments. Okay? Somewhere in most places in the world, in the 70s maybe, but probably in the 80s in most places, maybe even more recently in other places, the term HR started to become popular, right? Human resources was a term that had never, I don't think was ever used. I'm certainly not aware of it. So as I say, in very complex matters, and all these are very complex matters, people and organizations and how organizations become more effective and how we do effective training and development and capacity. These are all complicated matters. Sometimes pondering our choice of words can be quite insightful. So what do you think was on people's minds when we shifted from personnel departments, which of course is what the P is here, from personnel departments to HR departments? Why do you think that became a so much more fashionable term? There's no simple answer to that, but I'm just curious. What do you think? Because it didn't happen randomly. It happened gradually, but it started to become a kind of a global movement to shift from personnel to HR. Not a simple question. I'm asking a simple question. It doesn't have a simple answer, and we might have very different views. Yeah, for most people, what you can't hear is the lady in front is saying, you know, a little more focus on capacity, human beings, not just personnel. Personnel, I think, was seeming to a lot of people kind of cold, maybe the kind of numbers of it, as opposed to the spirit of it. So humans and focusing on humans seemed important to people. Go ahead.
Yeah, I think the common reason for the shift from personnel management to human resource management is that entrepreneurs or business owners started to realize that people
matter
is a big component
Yep.
in achievement
Exactly.
of your business goals.
Exactly. That's my take as well. And I think that's quite common around the world. There's only one small problem. Why did we use resources? Human resources. How many of you have kids? Right? How many of you have a spouse? Families, right? We all do. Would we call them human resources? Interesting. And of course not. I have a great bunch of human resources that I live with. We probably wouldn't say that. And yet, in the business world, and not just businesses, civil society organizations, governmental organizations, everybody's shifted over to this human resource. And I've always found it a very kind of complex issue, because I think part of it is what you were saying. People are starting to realize, entrepreneurs, business people, my organization is the people. It's not the buildings, it's not the spreadsheet, it's not the income or balance sheet. It's the people at some level. But we added on this strange word, resource. Do you know what the word resource means? By the way, ever looked it up in a dictionary? You can probably guess. Here's what you'll find in most dictionaries. Something like the following. Standing in reserve, waiting to be used. No kidding. Standing in reserve, hence the word resource, waiting to be used. So next time you think human resources is an enlightened term, you should talk to your people and say, I just want you to know, here's how I think about you. You're standing in reserve, waiting to be used. Interesting, huh? It's the exact same thing, of course, that happened in our societies, even earlier in the societies, when we started to talk about natural resources. standing in reserve, waiting to be used. What's the difference between seeing a forest and seeing timber resources? Interesting, isn't it? So human beings for a very, very long time have been aware of forests. For most of our societies, we go back far enough, particularly to the native peoples who lived where we live today, the forest was a teacher. The forest was most definitely alive. You might spend time in the forest looking for guidance. You might go there for a retreat. But you definitely don't go there just to get timber resources. You start to appreciate there's a very significant kind of cultural element here. And by the way, when I say culture now, I don't mean the Philippine or the American culture. I mean the industrial age culture. But suddenly during the industrial age, we had started to develop this huge appetite for all kinds of inputs to our businesses. And we started to consistently start to label those resources. Actually, it was probably quite an accurate way to reflect our thinking. Standing in reserve, waiting to be used. The forest is a bunch of trees standing there in reserve, doing nothing until we want to use them. Then they have value to us. I'm using the forest. Obviously, it's very different than people, but I'm using it to illustrate something. Behind even simple words is a worldview. All things said are said by somebody, and that somebody comes out of a context, a history, a culture, a setting. Use different words. And even the simplest words, if we ponder them, will often reveal things, maybe things we don't even like, about how we think. See, I think the word human resources is a real problem. And it's not because of the human part. I think what you said is exactly right. I think a lot of the sentiment that led to this was because people were starting to realize, actually, people matter. And we should be more serious about how we grow and develop our people. We should be more serious about how we work together, collectively to create an organization. All that stuff, I think, makes a lot of sense. But subtly, by virtue of the careless, I would say, relatively thoughtless, we didn't ponder this a lot. Because I guarantee you, if the people who were concerned that we want to convey that we really value our people, we really want to grow and develop our people, we really care about how we work together. If those very same people had said, oh yeah, but we really want to call you standing in reserve, waiting to be used, they wouldn't have done it. Yet we did it, because deep down, we can say we really care about our people, but the real question is, do we? And I would suggest to you, again, I know nothing about your organization. I know nothing about the Filipino business community. But I would say, in general, in most businesses, in most organizations, we're actually quite ambivalent. Yep, as they say in the high-tech industry, we know at the end of the day, our assets get in their cars and they drive home. We don't have anything without our people. Yep. We do know that. We've gradually been learning that. But still, we have a long shadow behind us. And it's a shadow that the people really are just labor inputs to production. That was the classic industrial age economic model. You have financial capital inputs to production, you have physical capital inputs to production, and oh, by the way, you have labor inputs to production. And of course, that's why we have had labor movements all around the world in the 19th century. Because people are starting to realize that we're just inputs to production, but together we could have power. We could assert that, no, we want to be valued. We want to be respected. We want to have certain rights. And none of that would have been necessary if there hadn't been already this established view that people are just an input to production. Notice I added the word just. That's a little editorializing. Now, why am I kind of pointing all this out? It's very easy to forget our history until all of a sudden it shows up as a problem. And I think, I don't know, of course, at all about the context, but I thought your comment in the back about, you know, could we be contributing as an association here to kind of a national expression and a coherent national perspective on the importance of people and growing people for the future of a society. See, at one level, this is actually quite a simple matter, but it gets very complicated because our histories are complicated. I'm on this particular trip, I'm not traveling a lot, I just was in Singapore for about 4 or 5 days, and now I'm here, and that's all my trip is. I'm just going to be here in a retreat for the next week. In any event, I remember years ago, Singapore was a very interesting phenomenon. Singapore is a country that's a city. It's very, very small. It is just a city. And it's surrounded by other countries today, like Malaysia. And I remember years ago when Singapore was starting to get a lot of attention in the 1980s because of its economic development. And it was when around the world people were starting to pay a lot more attention to this part of the world, Asia, for the quite unexpected economic growth. Korea, Japan, Singapore, obviously today China. And I'll never forget, though, Singapore was quite interesting. So I got to start, I think I made my first trip to Singapore around 1995 or 96. Singapore is already now a very successful country, and it's been a real hallmark of what's possible. But what really was interesting about Singapore is Singapore has nothing. They have no natural resources. They have no land. They have no trees. They have no minerals. They have nothing. And I'll never forget asking the head of the EDB, which is the organization in the government that's been kind of the steering, guiding force of Singapore, the Economic Development Board of Singapore. So what do you think is Singapore's lesson to the world? You're enormously successful as a country. You have no natural resources at all. And he said, oh, the key for everything in Singapore is we recognized early that we had only one resource. It was our people. Our people were it. That's all we had. And that awareness was catalytic and transformative in the minds of the Singaporeans. We have nothing. That's literally what he said. We have nothing except our people. And that's a mindset that has not really penetrated many other societies. If we had that mindset, a lot of the reasons many of you are here, a lot of things you really care about, we would be much further along. The development of our people, the respect of our people, understanding the diversity of cultures and traditions that our people represent, having some coherent national perspective on the importance of our people, we would not be confused if we thought all we have is our people. And I think that's the real impetus behind this whole HR movement. It's just, as they say, we got it confused by adding the resource part. And that's why it's interesting, and I hear you using the term here. What I've watched happen around the world in the last 10 years is as people start to realize this HR thing is kind of right and kind of wrong, a lot of them are going back to maybe a much older and simpler term. They're talking about people and people management, which is certainly closer to what it is. How do we grow our people? How do we align our people? How do we work together as human beings in a very complex undertaking as what our organization is up to? Do we care about our people? Really, not just in words. Do we really care about them? And, oh, by the way, there's enough evidence that probably all of you could point to that those organizations that do a much better job of that tend to do better, practically speaking. So there's a philosophic component of this, and there's a very practical component of this. What sort of environment do we create that really brings out the possibilities, the potential, the skills, the knowledge, the caring, the patience, the perseverance of our people? I like that term much better, as you can tell, than human resources. So I was very happy to see that you guys, while many people say, well, we're the Human Resource Association, that's actually not your name. And I like the fact that it now says People Management Association of the Philippines, because I think it's a lot more accurate. So those are just some of my reflections on the big journey we've all been on. My personal feeling is we're at the beginning still. We're nowhere near the end. Because as came out in some of your comments, yeah, this is about individual organizations, but it's also about industries. It's about the community of organizations, the norms, the practices, the understandings, the insights we share. If someone makes major breakthroughs in some areas of training and development, shouldn't that benefit other organizations as well? And that's, of course, one of the reasons for an association like this, that learning and understanding that gets developed over here starts to spread more widely. Oh, by the way, it obviously should spread to the schools, because our people are our people, actually. It's not just the people who are employed as workers, it's the kids. It's the older people who no longer work. So that kind of sentiment that societies need a kind of coherent philosophy that says, you know, like the Singaporeans said, actually we have nothing except our people. That would really have an impact. Now, I've watched Singapore's journey for a long time, and I was visiting there because I'm particularly interested in a lot of things they're trying to do today around healthcare. And you can find these same problems if you poke in almost any kind of core industry. And I'm using the word industry now in a very broad sense. I don't just mean a business. But healthcare is a core industry in all of our societies. And it too has suffered from very poor reflection. We call it a healthcare system, but of course it's not a healthcare system at all. We do know that, most of us, if we think. It's a disease treatment system. The Western medical model actually has no definition of health. I've asked doctors this for years, but I'm always curious. Well, you call yourself a healthcare system, then you ought to be able to answer the question, what actually is health? And they never can. And we tend to define health by the absence of diseases. How many of you have ever been around a 90-year-old person who had tremendous vitality and inspired you by their vitality? Did they have things that weren't quite working right with their body? Yes. Did they have diseases? Yes. And yet they had something that you would felt as health, enough that it really touched you. And you said, I would like to be like that when I'm 90 years old. See, so health is not the absence of disease. I know I've jumped to a totally different territory now, but you'll see in a minute they're not really that different. I'm using this also to illustrate. And it's been really interesting. I think the people in Singapore, I'm not sure exactly why, again, maybe because of that starting point. We really don't have anything, we just have ourselves. I've been in a kind of a deep ongoing learning about what does it actually take to build societies that can promote health and well-being for human beings. And while all of us want to make sure that we do a good job treating diseases, the Western medical model, none of us would want to throw it out, of course. It's taught us a lot about infections, it's taught us a lot, particularly in the public health area, of understanding what affects the health of populations. But it actually hasn't taught us what it takes to be healthy. As we all know, healthiness or health or well-being, or whatever phrase you would like, is actually quite complicated. And most of the things that seem to have the biggest impact on it, our Western doctors have no influence over. There's a big frustration for Western doctors. They're dealing with someone they can tell is not in a good state of health. And they know it's because of how they live. They know it's because of the stresses in their life. They know it's because of how they eat. They know it's because of how they exercise or don't exercise. And there's a lot of social determinants. People who grow up in unhealthy families are much more likely to be unhealthy. A lot of our poor in all of our societies eat very badly because everybody around them eats badly. Have lifestyles that are really not conducive to health at all, but people around them have the same lifestyles. So doctors have a pretty good understanding of this, and they can't do anything about it, except try to show somebody some results of a test and say, given this test, I really strongly recommend you should do this definitely, which usually has no impact whatsoever until that person has a stroke at the age of 52 years old or something that wakes them up. What's the common denominator here? I jumped over to healthcare because, of course, I was talking about Singapore. And by the way, what they're trying to do in Singapore is really interesting. They're really, I think, in early stages of a very significant journey that all of our societies will have to embark on before too long. Integrating public health and medicine. Look, there's a reason that in most of our societies today, life expectancy is probably twice as long as it was 100 years ago, right? It has almost nothing to do with Western medicine. It has everything to do with engineers, not doctors. Because it's about water, sanitation, the things that typically get categorized as public health, not medicine. And the two have not been well integrated. So they're now starting to get to the point where they're really trying to track the health and well-being of communities, not just individuals. And of course, because Singapore is close to 80% ethnic Chinese, they have a long tradition of traditional Chinese medicine. I met a wonderful man there who's an advocate in Thailand for traditional Thai medicine. Most of our societies have medical traditions which are not Western, which were totally poo-pooed, thrown out the window, called superstitious folklore by the Western-trained, quote, doctors or scientists, because they were not understood. And maybe to some degree they were folklore. But they're based on traditions of diagnosis, which in many cases are quite deep, treatment modalities, which usually have to do with how you eat and live. And the old, as they used to say, the old joke in China was, if you get sick, you fire your doctor. He was obviously not a very good doctor. He should have been able to perceive these imbalances much earlier, and so you should have corrected it to the point that you didn't have to manifest some symptom. So what's the common denominator between my little talking about health and medicine and healthcare and where we start off? In order to understand health and well-being, we have to understand humanness. We have to understand what it means to be a human being. This is I'm a systems guy, as some of you know. All my training is in understanding complex systems. This is a very complex system. A mind, heart, body system that nature's been at work at for many, many hundreds of millions of years. Has immense abilities to heal itself. If that weren't the case, none of our medical traditions would work. It's just that some of them, like the traditional ones, tend to work more with the healing capabilities of the system. Has immense capacities to learn and grow. Many would argue, I would be one, anthropologists, biologists, that actually, particularly evolutionary biologists, that actually if you look at this particular species, we don't have a lot going for us. We're not particularly fast, we're not particularly strong. Why do we survive? Why have we thrived? And many ironical ways, why have we become such a dominant species, for better or worse? We seem to have immense abilities to learn. And we are, like a lot of the advanced primates, very social. So we not only learn individually, we learn together. So this capacity to be healthy, to learn, to grow and adapt, and particularly to create relational settings or relational spaces or social spaces, social fields, where together we can do things that we can't possibly do individually. They kind of define us. And now maybe you see that whether you look at it as human or people management in business or health and well-being in medicine, you're actually dealing with a lot of the same things. So I guess from this standpoint, the single thought or idea that has been central in our work for a very long time is that in the modern day society, we actually have a very diminished understanding of humanness. We are very materialistic. The Western industrial age economic model that is now spread around the world so that I can go to a school in Singapore, or I can go to a school in Philadelphia, or I can go to a school any part of the, quote, developed world, and you know what? It's the same school. Because we export the industrial age education system along with all the other industrial age norms. And it was never about growing human beings, it was about training factory workers. It was all about technical skills, not social skills. It was all about how I fit in and became a good, oh, by the way, there's the word, resource, asset, or input for the needs of business, rather than how I become a good human being. So that, I guess, is kind of the core idea behind a lot of our work, is that we're ignorant and we don't even know that we're ignorant. Except it shows up now and then when we carelessly use words like resources, juxtaposed with humans, and think it's somehow an enlightened term. So the work I've been involved with for a very long time is very practical work. We started off initially primarily working in business. Over the years, many of us, like me, have spent now much more time in working with schools and educational organizations, done a lot of work with nonprofit organizations, and particularly, for me personally, a lot of work on how to get all these to work together around big social changes. And so all the things I'm saying to you, I know could sound rather philosophical or abstract. But there's only one reason I'm wasting your time talking about this. My experience, again and again, is they really matter practically. I've had the good fortune of working around masterful managers who really see their job as growing their people so they can grow their organization. And they can't imagine they could possibly grow their organization without growing their people. I had a good friend who worked for Ford, where the Society for Organizational Learning, SOL, grew out of an MIT research center that we formed actually in the mid-1980s. Became known as the MIT Center for Organizational Learning. And it was basically a small group of companies, mostly Western companies, that really saw these issues becoming critical. How we grow our people will shape how we can grow our organization. How we create an environment of trust, of ability to work together, to talk about difficult issues and not get tangled up in politics and internal games playing, and to reach beyond our organizations so our organizations actually are healthy contributors to their communities. And that was not a journey that I had expected. I didn't kind of set out to work with businesses. I actually had not that much interest in business. But then I kept meeting these people. They were amazing people. I mean, I was so taken by their depth and their very interesting blend of practical skills and philosophic depth. One of them was a man named Roger Salant. Roger was at Ford. He had his whole career at Ford. He was, in my opinion, from being around Ford for 15 or 20 years, a company I really admire a lot, he was actually one of their very best managers, and people knew it. But they could never figure out how he did what he did, because he was so contrary to the mainstream management model at that time. I remember, because I was around Ford a lot, I once asked somebody, I said, you know, when I'm around this company, I notice I'm always going like this. It seems to me like all of your top managers, and this is factual, I'm not kidding you, it may have changed more recently, all of your senior managers are like over 6 feet tall, or, you know, they're not quite 2 meters, but they're getting close to 2 meters. They're all big, and of course they're all men, and they're all big. Because I noticed I was always talking to people like this in conversations. And someone said, well, of course, you know, we're a culture of table thumpers. That was the term they used. To be a good manager in this company, you have to be able to make demands. You have to be able to smash your hand on the table, and people need to pay attention to you. That was the kind of management culture at that time. I think it's actually changed quite a bit. Roger didn't work that way, but Roger produced amazing results. I mean, literally, for about 15, 20 years in the middle of his career, they would move him from he was in manufacturing primarily, one manufacturing facility to another. What we always joke, the basket cases, the worst performing business. I mean, he managed a plant in Northern Ireland where the employees were all Protestants and the managers were all Catholics. Can you imagine a more difficult place to manage? So that was Roger's career for a long time. He was such an amazing, but no one had a clue how he did it. Because they'd ask him and he'd say, well, we do this, and they go, oh, it doesn't make any sense. Because he so contradicted the management model. I'll never forget, for example, Ford, in a time period where all the U.S. auto manufacturers were putting their plants all around the world. And sometimes, of course, they were in Southeast Asia, but a lot of times they were also closer to home because the shipping costs would be much less. So Roger was responsible for starting an electronics assembly facility in Mexico, in a rural part of Mexico, where his workforce would be ultimately about 6,500 people, over 6,000 people, about 2% of whom would have high school degrees. And they're supposed to produce a very sophisticated electronic components to Ford cars. 5 years later, that company was named the #1 manufacturing organization in Mexico by the Mexican government. So these are the kind of results Roger produced. It was like, amazing, how's this guy do it? And then I kind of got some real clues when I got to meet a lot of the people from that facility. So Roger had a plant in a very political part of rural Mexico. Well, it's a city, but it was not a highly, it wasn't Mexico City, it wasn't Monterrey, it wasn't one of the big, you know, manufacturing university centers of Mexico. It was very distant from that. And then many years later, I met people who had worked there, who were engineers. And they had engineering degrees. Even though when they first started working for Roger, they did not have high school degrees. Because Roger created a program inside the company for the employees to upgrade their technical skills so they could get the equivalent of a university degree, and then they even created a program where they could get engineering degrees. And I met so many people, particularly ladies, who said, my life has totally changed because I had Roger Salant as my manager. So I would meet these people like Roger, who just, they lived and breathed this first principle. I said it before, and I'm going to say it again, but to me, it is really the first principle. And in some sense, I think it's the reason associations like this really exist. To grow an organization, you must grow your people. Period. 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 They're not separate, and you can't separate them. And if you try to separate them, you won't be nearly as successful. Oh, by the way, growing your people isn't just a nice romantic notion. It's really difficult. Because you will encounter very different mental models. You'll encounter managers who say, oh, that's all really nice. We really believe in training development. We got to get people to work. Oh, by the way, when people get higher levels of education, they become a real pain in the ass. They challenge authority. They're coming out of a cultural setting where they've been trained to be submissive. I mean, rural Mexico, no high school degrees. Men and women, he had about 50% women, because it was a low production cost operation, which he's supposed to manage. This was Ford's concept. He's going to bring in 100 American engineer managers to manage 6,000 rural Mexicans. That was why they thought you'd do it. And guess what? You don't do that unless the people are highly submissive. But all of a sudden, he's got these people who are starting to get educated, and they no longer agree with what management's telling them to do. And they actually have some confidence that they can speak up and say, that's a really stupid way to do this. We could do it much better. So all this stuff about growing your people might sound good, but to the extent you have a culture, a management culture, that's about control, efficiency above all else, cost management above all else, which are two ways of typically saying the same thing. And you know, when all is said and done, if they're not good, we'll fire them and get somebody else. Right? That's the reality of most organizations from a cultural perspective, the management culture. Sure, we say all these great things about people and growing our people and all that, and oh yes, often we spend a lot of money on training and development, but please, please don't get them telling us how to do our job, because we are the managers. So this stuff all sounds good until you do it, in which case it becomes very radical. Very radical. And it can have a huge positive impact, but it isn't easy. And you have to be prepared to deal with the very difficult, conflictual processes of change. I don't know your organization. I don't know Filipino organizations. So this is a generalization. My experience and conclusion is the vast majority of organizations in the world are still managed in some combination of a colonial or an industrial model. The colonial part, because they have colonial histories in many places of the world, and we all know what that management model was all about, right? The industrial one, which is all about efficiency, it's all a big assembly line. The key is to keep the line moving, keep costs as low as possible, and people are what? A cost. They're a labor input, which shows up on your balance sheet as a cost. It does not show up on your balance sheet as an asset. Right? So, to the extent that that's possible, all I'm saying is I really support the kind of aspirations I heard expressed, but my experience is the work is really difficult. And it will not go forward if you don't have enough Rogers in your management ranks. You've got to find people who have power today, who understand that no, the future is really our people are our asset. Because they have the power. And how you cultivate those relationships and how you help people kind of grow into their capabilities as leaders in the management ranks is very, very important. So in a sense, everything I've learned from people like Roger. And no one else in the company understood what the hell he did back then. Now, I do think it's changed, because fortunately he wasn't the only one. There were 3 or 4 other Rogers who were doing amazing things. And then there were many hundreds of people who actually were really interested, managers who were really interested. They said, I see what you've done, but I don't quite understand it. Help me understand. No coincidence, by the way, I enjoy telling stories about organizations that I know well. when the U.S. government, as you know, our American automobile industry has been under great stress for a long time. It hasn't been very cost competitive compared to counterparts, particularly in Asia and to some degree in Europe. Hasn't been particularly innovative compared to many. And it wasn't that long. I'm trying to remember what year it was. It was 2008, 2009, when the CEOs of all the auto companies literally went to Washington, Ford, General Motors, and Chrysler, and said, we're going to become bankrupt. And they were bailed out by the government. The government basically pushed a lot of their liabilities, which were pension funds. They had huge pension fund liabilities, except one. One said, no, it's all right. We understand that our counterparts need it, but we think we can actually make it without being bailed out by the government. That was Ford. Ford refused to be bailed out by the government because they were actually learning how to manage again. And they were actually realizing that innovation, not manufacturing efficiency, was the key to their future. And they've been getting better and better at it. And that's why today they are, without doubt, far and away the most well-managed and successful U.S. auto company. And that's the last theme I'll touch on. So I'm just trying to touch on the same subject in a couple different ways. That journey, and I use Ford and the U.S. auto industry to illustrate, industries which have their roots in the core industrial age model, efficiency, cost control, standardization. And when you apply that to human beings, guess what you get? Human resources that need to be managed efficiently and in a standardized way, just as if you were producing cars on an assembly line. Gradually, those companies start to wake up in different settings. They'll wake up at different speeds and realize, no, actually, the future to be successful is about innovation, not efficiency. Efficiency is always important. Don't misunderstand me. I'm not saying efficiency is unimportant. If you're a manager anywhere, you have to pay attention to how resources are used. It's part of your job. It's just not all of your job. Innovation is about people. You know what innovation means? Creating new sources of value. That's how Peter Drucker always defined innovation. Creating new sources of value. So it can be in products, it can be in service, it can be in the technology, it can be in all kinds of ways. Who does creating? Do machines do creating? Not really. They might be part of the process. Creating is done by people. So how you create an environment that can really be good at innovating turns out to be the practical imperative that's gradually shifting management philosophy all around the world. So companies are realizing that it's not just a philosophical conviction that who we are as our people. If I want to be a successful enterprise in the future, it's a pragmatic necessity. How do you create an environment where people can innovate? Oh, by the way, the one other implication of that is social, not just personal. This is something that's very poorly understood by people outside the high-tech industries. But you know, you go around those businesses, and they're just so different. And by the way, not just in the U.S., all around the world. If you visit the Alibaba in China, you'll see pictures all around the walls of their founders, their initial group of about 30 or 40 employees, all doing headstands. Because that was one of the things they all did. They all did headstands. They're against the wall, and they're all in their headstands. And they said, you need it for a new point of view. You have to continue to keep changing your perspective. And they're really a fun group. I mean, they're playful. Oh, they're very serious. They work really hard. But there's an energy there. The essence of innovation is ultimately social. How do you create an environment that's more playful, that's less serious? Creating involves play. It involves the spirit of play. Now, as managers in businesses, you can do this in actually a very disciplined way. It doesn't mean that it's all random. It's not just like kids on a playground. There's discipline to it. But the spirit of it is what's really important. You create a work environment where actually people want to be there because they're having fun and they're doing something that really means something to them. That's when you kind of look a little deeper at what creates an innovative environment. It's all about a social condition. I'll tell you one last story. So when we founded Society for Organization Learning, we had a mix of sort of mainstream traditional manufacturing organizations like Ford and the early stage, very successful technology companies. Hewlett-Packard was one of the founders of the network, as was Ford, as was Intel and Harley-Davidson. Talk about a company that has fun. Harley-Davidson, they have a lot of fun. Anyhow, so this is a story about HP. It's a part of Hewlett-Packard that was, for many years, the biggest and most successful financially. The people who made the little cartridges for your printers. They call it the Ink Supply Organization. Very sophisticated technology. And it has to be produced at a low cost because you produce hundreds of millions of these things. And it's a little bit like we used to always joke that the razor blade model. Razor companies, they give away the razor because they make the money selling you the blades. Still true. That's how Gillette makes all its money. It has nothing to do with razors, but they sell you blades. Well, the printers, they virtually give away, right? They're really cheap. You sell a lot of cartridges. Anyhow, so this is the part of the company who made these. But that has nothing to do with the story. So what was really interesting is that in one of our projects with HP, they were doing what they called reflective social network analysis. That was their term. But that's the term they use basically for their bosses in Palo Alto. So this is a division of about 10,000 people. It's a big organization. And as I say, it was the most profitable, most successful part of the business for many, many years. Probably still is. But anyhow, so they're studying social networks. Now, how did they do it? They did it in a very different way. I'd never seen anybody who done this way. They basically would get engineers together. Of course, it's a company of engineers. And they would have the engineers identify a critical product innovation or a process innovation, a critical innovation that had proven to really be hugely successful for the company. But then they asked them this question: who was essential for achieving that innovation? Because they wanted to get at the networks, the social networks. Because as you might imagine, you'd have a group of people in one division or one team that had a particular technical definition, but in fact, when they really traced the most successful innovations, they had worked with people way over here, and they had worked with people way over, they crossed boundaries. Many of the teams, when they really did their social network maps, critical members of the teams were in customers. They had crossed the boundary of Hewlett-Packard and their customers. And literally, in some cases, they had research groups situated in customers' organizations. So yeah, this was the nature of the work, none of which has to do with my story also. All that is background. So they're going through, they've been doing this for several years, identifying these networks related to different successful innovations. And they found one network, when they really had studied, had probably 2 or 3 times more impact on the company's bottom line than any other network they could find. It had been responsible for several crucial product innovations and process innovations. And so they're really interested, naturally. Who are the people in this network? It was about 30 people. They were from very different parts of the organization. And as they're studying it, some real puzzles came up. First off, they were all women. Now, at that time, my guess is that facility, which was about 8,000 people in Oregon, the primary facility, had probably about 25% women engineers. There's a lot of women. But the odds of a network of 30 people who had this impact, all being women, were very low. So they're studying, where do these people come from? They're all over the organization, and they're all women. And then somebody finally says, oh, it's the Quilting Circle. Now I have to explain this. Have you ever heard of quilting? It's an old American pastime where poor people would take fabric, then take pieces of it and make new things by putting together pieces of old fabric in a day when people just didn't go to the mall and buy something new. right? They had to use and reuse, like all of our societies. And the particular tradition in America is called quilting. Well, this was a group of ladies who enjoyed quilting. And many, many years earlier, they'd created a little group. So at lunchtime, once a week, they'd all get together and they would quilt. Well, you can imagine the puzzlement of the Hewlett-Packard executives as they're getting deeper and deeper into this. What are they doing in this quilting circle that makes them... And so they, of course, start talking to a lot of the individuals who didn't really know that they'd had this kind of impact on the business. It was only because of the way they were analyzing critical innovations that it even became visible. They were looking for what networks have had the biggest impact on our business. So they're talking, bringing in these ladies from the Quilting Circle, and they're telling them all about quilting and what they do. And say, how come you guys have had so many significant product innovations? What do you do in the Quilting Circle meetings? And the lady said, well, we quilt. Well, what do you do when you quilt? Well, we talk, and we quilt, and we talk. And what do you talk about? Well, we talk about our kids, and we talk about our husbands, and we talk about our work. You know, we're engineers. Naturally, we talk about everything. This simple story is starting to illustrate a principle which is beginning to be understood in the highly innovative technology companies. But it's so radical that a lot of them don't even want to talk about it, or they talk about it in different ways. If the managers had tried to manage the Quilting Circle, they would have killed it. Right? What made the Quilting Circle effective was it was a natural environment where people got together to just relax and do something they enjoyed. And they talked. If Hewlett-Packard had not been a culture where people really did enjoy their work, as a high commitment sort of culture, it wouldn't have worked either. Because when the people are together just naturally doing what they do naturally, they would talk about their work. And somebody working in this part of the division would learn about something in this part which they never would have learned about. Not because a manager said, you guys should become a network, but because they were diverse. Diversity, relaxation, no problem-solving agenda. Today, we call this the principles of healthy social spaces. Diversity, naturalness, no management agenda. People just being people, hanging out, relaxed, getting to know each other, appreciate each other, learning about their kids, learning about their lives. Have you ever heard of Bose speakers? Probably most of you have. Probably the most successful speaker company in the world, B-O-S-E, Bose. Founded by an MIT guy, an MIT professor of electrical engineering named Anwar Bose. So Anwar was kind of a quirky guy. Obviously, he was a brilliant engineer. But one of his quirks was that he believed that no one should ever have a coffee or tea at their desk. So in every Bose engineering facility, they would have nice places where people could go to have a coffee or tea when they wanted to take a break. Because he was convinced those conversations over coffee or tea were critical for innovation. Otherwise, everybody is in a silo. They don't ever talk to the people in the other parts of the organization. The principle of social space. So this gets misrepresented often in the tech industry. Oh, they have all these parties, and they're all very frivolous, and all that. No, they understand. Create settings where people get to hang out, relax, have a coffee, talk, quilt, whatever. I'm just using this to illustrate just how radical real innovation environments have to be. Radical relative to our traditional inherited management culture. But they're not radical relative to human beings. They're just being people, real people with each other. So those are some of the ideas I think an association like this could really be advancing. And I don't mean to make light of it because, again, the challenges are very real, and you have to understand your culture, your context, and I don't. but I have watched this journey in many different places around the world. And it's really kind of paradoxical in a way. We're trying to become more and more sophisticated as organizations that can innovate, which paradoxically means becoming more and more human as the kind of places that we'd like our kids to work in. Thanks.
Now may we call in our reactors panelists. First we have Dr. Cesar Baltazar, the Managing Director of Career Academy Incorporated. Next is Ms. Michelle Guse, the Vice President Annual Conference Chairperson and VP and CHRO of Coco Life. Third reactor is Ms. Yamin Madison, Vice President and CHRO of Sun Life of Canada, and one of the PMAP Board of Trustees. And lastly, Mr. Jeffrey Dalla Serna, Vice President and Chief Human Resource Officer of National Grid Corporation of the Philippines. Let us also call on stage our moderator, Mr. Jerry Plana, CEO of Investors in People.
Okay, we have a few minutes to have a conversation with Dr. Peter Senge. And I'd like to get the ball rolling immediately so that we can maximize this very rare opportunity to interact with a great mind, Dr. Peter Senge. You know, a few years back, in 1980 was the first time I heard you. You were very much younger then. That was an event organized by the Pegasus Communications, if you recall. One of those events, learning organization. That was when your book was really, you know, very popular at the time. You know, I was able to pick up a few key points based on this presentation that you made. So probably we can throw this around, because here we have in the panel HR heads of their respective sectors, and we have one OD guru here, Cesar Baltazar. One of the first takeaway I have, which I think is very important, is your summarization of it all when you said there is a diminished understanding of humanness. I think that this is a very profound observation. When I reflect on the HR practice, we feel good when we're with associates like this in PMAP because we share the same thing. We champion the same thing. But when we go back to our respective organizations, we are surrounded by people who are numbers oriented. And sometimes some of us just get swallowed by it, you know, by the system. Probably we can have a quick round of our, you know, panelists here. You know, what kind of a challenge do you face, very briefly, in this area of making more Rogers, as Peter would say, in your own respective organization? Let's start with Jeffrey.
Well, actually, that's a tough question. And I was saying to Peter that his speech and his topic is very thought-provoking. But let me answer it this way. You know, if mostly all organizations are numbers-driven, it's factual, it's true, it's natural. But at the end of the day, you know, let me say this quote, which I'm so into for so many years. A true master is not the one with the most students, but one who creates most masters. A true leader is not the one with the most followers, but the one who creates most leaders. So to answer your question is, numbers will be a natural result. If you indeed and we indeed grow more leaders, not just grow the training hours. And that's it.
Okay, thank you, Jeffrey. Probably we can move on to Meets.
First off, Thank you, Peter. I've been struggling for weeks, actually, thinking of the AC theme, and have had sleepless nights, no? But today, it's like, finally getting the answer to what we need to push for. And that's really hard work for everybody. And we look at, yes, as HR being guardians of humanity, we are so afraid, somehow, after reading a lot about AI and technology and robotics, I got so scared of what the future will bring. But then I realized when you spoke this morning, or just a while ago, I said, we have had robots long ago, and that's us. When we thought of humans as resources, we have become the robots that we are dreading to face in the future. And that's a big realization that I'm struck with. And it's, I think, blessed with a very passionate president who wants to take out the box. Really pursue hard work for the annual conference. So really thank you for the insight. There's no numbers that can define that. It's good for me, I'm a psychologist, I don't like numbers. But working in a non-life insurance industry where you report to an actuary, everything is just abstract because of the numbers, but it doesn't equate. There's no 1 + 1 there when it comes to humans. And that's what I love about our profession, because we're not accurate, we're not precise, but we're flexible. There's no square, there's no box, there's no circle. It's, I don't know what you call that shape, cauliform maybe. We're all shapes. And yes, more than any Rogers maybe, we were looking at a lot of Michelles in the Philippines actually. And I think that when you spoke about Singapore having a resource, their only resource as people, the Philippines is very rich in natural resources. That's why we're like this. we don't mind a lot of things. We can just pick guavas and eat that for lunch. That's how we grew up. But we're also rich with natural disasters and calamities and what have you. So I guess in that belief, I truly think that even Philippine HR is something we can bring to the world because of how flexible we have been. And we have a lot of great examples here as well of Rogers that you have talked about earlier. So thank you.
Thank you also, Peter. I found it very thought-provoking, as everybody else has said. I like that we went back to what human resources meant and what you said about having to go back to the context. So from tomorrow, I will call myself Chief People Officer rather than Chief HR Officer. But, just going back to, I especially like, we're an organization, a financial services organization, which are very often looked at as quite traditional in the Philippines. And one of our challenges is trying to innovate. So what you said about the essence of innovation is social, and we have to create a natural environment where people can play really resonated with me. But going back to your question about leaders and creating Rogers in the organization, when I think back at the time that Sun Life was beginning to be successful, I think the key to our success was really our leaders. They're real models of integrity, of hard work, of ethics, and I think of humanness. So I think what you said about creating Rogers in every organization is very, very important. So thank you.
I came to this meeting expecting Peter to talk about systems thinking, mental model, team learning, but no, he did not. He hit us with something more fundamental. It's about humanness. And I think that's all there is to it about managing people in organizations. the question of how do we do it? How do we create more Rogers in the organization? Well, by way of experience, because we started talking of the term human resources in my company then, San Miguel, in the mid-70s. And we had a simple answer. It's really, you know, this thing about humanness is just like talking about the gospel. It's nice to talk about it, but it's hard to really follow. So what can be done is to simply just do it. Especially people like us in organizations, just do it. Keep on going until you create what perhaps Peter is familiar with in engineering. You create a critical mass of people. More and more people doing it the right way will make it happen. So I guess that's the way to go.
Probably we can go back to Peter, and probably the question here as we try to wrap up this side of the conversation is, you know, why is it hard for managers to get the idea that you can only grow the numbers in a sustainable way through people? What has been your experience of why, you know, this is kind of hard to get? You know, the reason why I'm asking that is, if you take a look at the history, balanced scorecard was something that I got excited because somehow it told us a story that, you know, the financial numbers are just at the end of the tail, you know, end of the line, really. So if you really want to improve that, you have to go back to the line, and that's where you see people. So, but how come, you know, there are very few organizations, as you said, that still are catching into this kind of a mindset, Peter?
Well, I think we have to recognize that these are deep issues. They are cultural, not just in the sense of organization culture, they come from the world we live in. One of the people who was a real teacher for me many, many years ago was Ed Deming, founder of the quality movement, W. Edwards Deming. And in the last few years of Ed Deming's life, he used to often say, because he got away from the language of quality management. He found that even though it seemed to express his understanding early on, as it got more widespread, it got made more superficial. It just became about quality circles and another way to improve efficiency. And he used to say things like, he started to call his work, he changed the label, he called it transformation of the prevailing system of management. That was the language he used a lot in the last 5 years of his life, the transformation of the prevailing system of management. But then I heard him on many times say, and we will never succeed in doing that without transforming the prevailing system of education. It's the same system. Workers come to work expecting to have the boss tell them what to do because they all went to school where the teacher told them what to do. Workers think it's all about the numbers because the teachers told us it was all about passing the tests. And on and on. And so I think that illustrates something that ought to not give us, we shouldn't be too discouraged. It's just that the same basic ideas are woven in the key institutions of our society. The reason he focused on education a lot, he said it's the formative institution. You know, we enter education when we're 5, 6 years old. So by the time we graduate, whatever year that is in schooling, you know, we've been immersed in this authority system for a long time. School, for most kids, is not about learning how to think. It's about how to get the right answers. It's not about working together. We call collaboration cheating, right? And it's about pleasing the teacher. I remember when our oldest son was 8 years old, he came home one day and he had this epiphany. He said, I got it. It's about guessing the answer that's in the teacher's head. So I just use this to illustrate. The same basic models woven into different institutions mean that this is not just as much as one individual organization. Not surprisingly, you'll find individual organizations who just break the mold, typically because of some idiosyncratic combination of circumstances and individuals. So they did, but it doesn't create a larger change because the larger structural forces are still in place. So these are really problems our societies will have to outgrow. I mean, I don't mean to make it sound too hopeless. I don't think it's hopeless at all. I think it's very natural. In fact, I spend now most of my time, 80% of my time, working with primary and secondary education, because I think that institution is going through profound changes around the world, in pockets. Not everywhere. I think there is a real renaissance. People are seeing that the industrial age school model simply doesn't work. Kids are not engaged. They're not learning the skills we want. At MIT, they have a saying, our schools are teaching skills for jobs that no longer exist. And so whether it's that very practical concern, are we really preparing a workforce for the future, or our deeper concern that, well, really, if any institution should be about human development, it should be the school. So I think we really have to work across boundaries in ways we're not used to. And it will take time. And we need innovators. We need pockets of light that show what's possible. And we need to understand how they do what they do. And, you know, that it really is ultimately practical. I mean, that's always the problem. You start talking like this, people say, oh, it all sounds so wonderful. That's the problem, human resource. You know, oh, it sounds so wonderful. We ought to treat our people. But no, you got to do this to be successful more and more in the world we're living into. And that's the last part. The world is changing. You know, being the most efficient company is no longer the most successful company. And we know that. It's just that we don't know how to change these deep cultural norms. But I also think, and I think you used exactly the right term, Balthazar, the critical mass. These kind of changes, it looks like nothing's happening, nothing's happening, nothing's happening, because very slowly that critical mass is building, but it's below the surface. Once it happens, a lot can change in a hurry.
Thank you, Peter. Probably just another round quickly. What I'd like to hear from our panelists is, after hearing Peter today, what is the takeaway in terms of what you will do differently when you go back to your organizations? Like, for instance, he mentioned a few interesting, like the quilting circles. You know, I think that's a very good example of the kind of organization we should really be building, you know, where people are relaxed, they are themselves, less systems probably, less controls. Sometimes some organizations have dispensed for more systems and more controls until they become so rigid, you know. So takeaway. Let's start from Jeffrey and then we'll move on.
You throw in a lot of difficult questions. There's a lot of takeaway. In fact, my notes is not enough for me to be able to organize and digest all of the, not just principles, but thought-provoking statements given by Peter. You know, as many of us do a lot of organization development, and as many of us do a lot of people training, there is this question that you need to ask, and this is my takeaway. If the organization is indeed sincere in what we say, that we need to grow our leaders, we invest a lot of bucks, we invest a lot of money to it, but where do we really put our people after the training? Are they being utilized, or are they just being lined up? Show to the board that you have a long lineup of successors, which is exactly the term human resources. Do you show to the board that you have already one or two anytime if a manager leaves? That's indeed the human side, the HR side. But my biggest takeaway is, are we giving value to such programs? And are we indeed sincere and honest to such programs? Because if we are not sincere and honest, indeed, these leaders will just feel that they're just for the trophy of the head of human resources saying to management that I did my part. And that manager is just a testament of the program. Nothing more, nothing less.
Okay, Mitch?
Yeah. It's the love month, so it's okay to be cheesy. No, it's really, I think it's family. Family. Peter clearly made it clear to me today. all the thoughts I have been having, struggling with the past months. But we're Filipinos, and that's what's really important to all of us. And as HR, no, I don't want to. No, human managers. I'm going to take out the R there. Okay. Whatever we are today, as human as we can be, or as Filipino as we can be, the best thing we can do for our employees is really bring them back to their families. Education starts at home. And I think that if we look at what's really important to our people, it's the people they go home to. And if we can touch the lives of their families or integrate that in what we do, then we really make great impact. And I think as well, even for the nation, we've always thought, I've always seen ourselves as, separated by islands. We have all our interests. We've never been united as a country. But what if we teach Filipinos that the Philippines is a family, one country, one family? Maybe we will treat people who are different from us differently because we think they're family. We treat family differently, right? We fight for family. We sacrifice for family. And if we think, all of us think that the Philippines is just one family, then we might be united for the first time. Or, yeah. As in whatever we do, we try to integrate everything. So thanks again. It's clarifying everything. What's basic, what's important, what's the core of everything. So yeah, that's it.
In my organization, we're going to have to play more. And my team is here as well, so I'm going to throw that challenge at them. I know it probably sounds simple, throw a few toys around and some, relaxation, areas, but it isn't. I think, we have a long culture of being very systematic, very structured, and we need to move forward and become more innovative. And we've been trying to get to a formula to get people to become more innovative. And I think that's a real take-home for me. Maybe it isn't a formula, maybe it's just the environment that we're cultivating in the organization. So you're going to see us playing more.
I'll summarize my takeaways in one word: learning. People must learn, organizations must learn continually. But we have a problem because for many, many years, centuries even, I think we have taken the responsibility for learning away from the learner. And that's been the source of problems. We have told our learners that this is what you need. We have told our learners that this is the course that we should be taking. We have also assessed the learners, even given them grades to find out how well they're doing. And that's been the problem. So to succeed in the present times, I think we must promote continuous learning. And it's not going to be just learning for now, learning for the organization, but lifelong learning. And even life-wide learning. Thank you.
Okay, just to recap our very brief interaction with Peter here, although we were a little bit disappointed he did not talk about the learning organization, but I think he really talked about the foundation of the learning organization, which is not most of the time touched on. So with this, we'd like to really thank Peter for sharing his time and his great thoughts this day with us. Thank you very much, Peter, and I hope you have many more adventures and discoveries and developments that you can share to the worldwide community. Thank you very much, Peter. And our panelists, thank you very much for joining us in this conversation.